The guards burst into the queen's chambers just as Yang was picking up his shirt. The door flew open so violently that the candle on the table almost went out. One of the guards stood in the doorway and shouted, "What's going on here?" Yang froze with his hands on his belt. The queen rose from her bed, wearing only a nightgown. She looked at the guard calmly, or rather, with the kind of calmness that only someone accustomed to keeping people at a distance could muster. "Step aside," she said. The guard took half a step forward and stopped. He saw her, saw Jan, and said quietly, "I am reporting this as treason." The queen slowly placed her hand on the table and said, "No, be silent first." The guard did not take a step back, but he did not move either. Jan was silent. His lips trembled, but he did not look at the guard or the queen. The queen closed the door, and only then said, "Go, in order that no one enter this part of the castle until morning." The guard glanced back once more, then turned and left. After that, the night was not the same. They both understood that the incident might not have been an accident. The queen sat on the edge of the bed and silently adjusted her cloak. Jan stood by the window, not knowing where to put his hands. She sighed and said, "Sit down." He sat down. She looked at him and asked quietly, "Are you afraid?" He answered honestly, "I am afraid, but not for myself, for you." She tilted her head. "Why for me?" He looked up and said what would later be repeated in their conversations. "Because you are the queen, and people see you differently. You are not my past, and that makes everything dangerous." She smiled without joy and said, "I know what I'm doing." He nodded, but did not believe her. Jan came to court 4 months ago. His name was Jan de Mont, and he was 24 years old. He was from a minor noble family and served one of the knights at a tournament. The king noticed him and took him into the royal chamber. Jan was good at minor duties. He brought documents, held the queen's gloves, and made sure the candles were lit. He was not talkative. He knew how to listen. This is what attracted the queen. Her husband, the king, was busy with councils, negotiations, and gaining influence. He did not ask how her day had gone, nor did he wait for answers. The queen had many responsibilities, but few interlocutors who could listen and not ask for anything in return. The first conversation that ceased to be formal took place in the library. Jan was standing by the bookcase when the queen approached him after the reception had ended. She said, "Bring me a book on the laws. Everything is mixed up." He found the right volume, put it on the table, and did not leave. They talked about order, about the affairs of the castle, then about the letters she received. He suddenly said, "You are tired." She replied, "Yes." He said, "You don't sleep." She sighed and said, "I can't sleep when I have so much to do." He lowered his eyes, then raised his hand and touched her fingers to help her adjust her cuff. It was just a simple action, but she noticed it. She felt an attention that no one had given her in a long time. After that, their meetings became more frequent. He brought gloves, forwarded letters, locked the hall doors when necessary. There were moments when they stood side by side in silence. These silences were not empty. Through them passed glances, brief touches, a hand touching the hem of her dress with a clasp, a palm lingering for a second on a scroll. They talked about trivial things, but in those trivialities, things were revealed that were not usually discussed in front of others. He talked about his parents, about the fear of being a nobody in a big castle. She talked about the emptiness of the night, about how holidays were work for her, not joy. He listened and did not try to give advice. She appreciated that. They found a place to talk, a small room by the chapel where there was an old cupboard with prayer books. Rarely anyone was there after midnight. Jan came quietly, lit a candle, and sat down on a narrow chair. She came during her free hours. They talked, took off their masks, allowing themselves not to be queen and servant. Sometimes he read her letters that had been sent not directly to her, but to the royal chancellery. Sometimes she asked him to tell her what he had seen among the common people. He spoke briefly, without flattery. She responded simply. There were no loud declarations between them. It felt as if they were treating each other with care, so as not to break each other. Gradually, habit grew into affection. She began to wait for his footsteps in the corridor, recognizing them by the sound. He began to find reasons to stay with her longer. Their touches remained restrained, but there was more to them than work. They laughed quietly, exchanged glances that could say more than words. When she got tired, he would bring her water and sit next to her. She would sometimes look at him and say, as if to test herself, "Do you know what you want?" He would simply reply, "I want to be here." She would nod, nothing more. They began exchanging letters. They were short notes hidden between the pages of the prayer book that always lay on her desk. He wrote, "I saw you smile today." She wrote, "Thank you for being there." These notes were not passionate confessions. They were like confirmation that someone understood. She hid them under her easel, in the most secluded corner of the chest of drawers. He brought her small gifts at night, a piece of bread from the best loaf, a feather that had fallen from her favorite book. All of this seemed important to them. But the house was full of rumors. The servants noticed that Jan often lingered in the queen's chambers. They saw him come at night and leave at dawn. Once, one of the servants, a young man named Tom, saw Jan leaving through a side door. He told the others, "I saw him at the queen's. It's not just service." The rumors spread from the guard to the stoker, from the stoker to the cook. No loud words were spoken, but the whispers grew. The queen knew there were rumors. Jan knew too. They talked about it, and the queen said, "If anyone says anything, I will say it is a lie." Jan said, "But a lie can become the truth if you hear it often enough." She gently touched his hand and said, "Then we'll be quieter." A few weeks later, the king announced that he was preparing for a campaign. He gathered the knights in the courtyard and said briefly, "All able-bodied men are needed. Jan, you go with them." Jan stood in line, not knowing what to do. The queen approached him after the gathering and said, "Go. It is the king's order." He looked at her and replied, "I will not be able to write or hear from you for a long time." She squeezed his hand. "Write to me. I'll hide the letters in my prayer book. Just don't tell anyone about us." He nodded. Inside, both of them had a growing feeling that the distance could be dangerous. They understood that every day of separation increased the risk that someone would hear and believe the rumors. I will end the first part of the story with what they both knew. Their relationship was no longer just a secret between two people. The castle was full of prying eyes, and one of the notes Jan had placed in the prayer book could be seen by someone for whom it was not intended. They silently carried this knowledge like a heavy burden, not knowing who would take the first step towards exposing them. John left early in the morning. The corridor was quiet. The queen came to the castle gate, stood by the carriages and watched as he was helped onto his horse. He approached her, took off his glove and took her hand. He did not say, "I love you" out loud. He said quietly, so that no one could hear, "I will return." She replied in the same tone, "Wait for me here." He smiled, but there was no joy in her smile. He raised his head, and looked at the king, who was standing aside. The king did not look at them. It was clear that this was an order, and it was impossible to argue with him. Jan took the reins and rode away. In the first days after his departure, the queen did not write long letters. She took her prayer book, opened it to a single page, and hid a short note between the pages. The notes were simple. I am thinking of you. Write if you can. I am waiting. One night she wrote more. She sat down at the table, took a pen, wrote, reread, folded the sheet twice and hid it in the book. It was hard for her. She understood that she was acting against the rules, but she couldn't imagine how else to live. When she wrote, her hand trembled. She swore to herself to remain silent, but the words flowed onto the paper. The first letters from John arrived 2 weeks later. They were short. He wrote about the journey, about the road, about how cold it was at night. He wrote that he was thinking of her and added details. I saw a horse by the well, and I thought you would laugh if you were here. These words were not poetic. They were simple and honest, and that made them precious to the queen. She read the letters before bed and hid them in her prayer book. Sometimes she replied immediately. Sometimes she put it off. There was a 3-week pause between letters. During this time, rumors in the castle grew stronger. The servants whispered, and the dining room fell silent when Jan's name was mentioned. The queen tried to remain open, but inside, she grew increasingly anxious. She spent more time in the chapel room, keeping her prayer book with her and rereading the notes. One night, she opened the book and found that one of the notes had fallen out and was lying on the windowsill. She picked it up, pressed it to her chest, but then carefully put it back and hid it again. It seemed to her that each piece of paper was a bridge to a person who was far away, and if the bridge was broken, nothing would remain. There was a woman in the castle who looked after the books and fabrics. Her name was Martha. She was an old servant of the chapel and knew where the candles were kept and how to repair the candlesticks. One morning, the queen asked Martha to clean the prayer book. The pages were dusty after the night and needed to be thoroughly wiped. The queen gave the book to Martha and said quietly, "Clean it and return it to me as soon as possible." Martha bowed and left. Martha worked in silence. She turned the pages, wiped them clean, and carefully smoothed out the creases. When she reached that page, something was stuck between the pages. Martha took out the paper and saw a note. She read 2 lines. They were simple words. "I will wait." Martha stopped reading. She knew it was none of her business, but then she thought about the rumors circulating around the castle. She became curious about what exactly was in this note. She hid it in her sleeve and took the book to the storeroom. In the storeroom was an old priest who came several times a week to check the prayer books and discuss the service. His name was Father Michael. Martha knew that he was very attentive to the royal family. She approached him and said, "Father, I found a note in the Queen's book. I thought I would give it to you, so you can decide what to do with it." Father Michael took the paper, looked at the handwriting, and hesitated. He looked at Martha and said, "Show me." She handed him the note. Father Michael read a few more lines, and his face became stern. He folded the note and put it on the table. Father Michael did not immediately tell the king or anyone else. He knew that the news could cause an uproar at court. He knew that the queen was the person who ran the affairs of state, and any weakness on her part would call that into question. He decided to speak to the queen personally first. He went to her chambers, asked for an audience, and entered when the queen was alone. She looked up and asked, "What is the matter, Father?" He placed the note in front of her. She looked at the paper, picked it up, and recognized the handwriting. Her hands trembled. She said quietly, "It's Jan." Father Michael sat down and did not say immediately how he would proceed. He spoke calmly. "This is difficult. I need an answer. Why are you hiding letters in a holy book?" She withdrew her hand. "I hide them because I am afraid. I'm afraid someone will see them and use them against me. I know it's wrong, but I can't do anything else." He looked at her and said, "You are the queen. Your actions have consequences not only for you." She replied sharply, "You don't understand. You have never been mine. You have never lain in my bed or held my hand in the silence of the night." He closed his eyes for a second and said, "I understand one thing. If this becomes known, there will be trouble. I did not come to judge. I came to help you make a decision." She asked, "What decision?" He said, "You won't be able to hide it for long. I can help you atone in church and give you my blessing, but that means you must end this relationship. If you continue, I will not be able to remain silent." She stood up and walked to the window. She spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. "Do you think I'm not afraid? Do you think it's easy for me to leave the man who understands me? I'm not asking for your blessing. I'm asking you not to hand me over to the king on paper. I'm asking you to have mercy on me." Father Michael looked at her and said, "I cannot remain silent if it threatens innocent people. But I don't want to cause harm. Give me time." She sat down and closed her eyes. She felt trapped between the man she loved and her duty to the crown. The next day, Father Michael returned the note to Marta and told her to keep everything secret. He said he would take care of the book himself, but inside, he had made a decision. He would not tell the king right away, but would keep an eye on things. He spoke to one of the servants who was close to the queen and said gently, "Let the queen be careful. It is better that people do not see too much." The servant left and reported this to the queen in the form of advice, and she agreed to act cautiously. Jan received rare letters while on campaign. He wrote that he was thinking of returning and that his thoughts were with her. Sometimes he wrote about battles, about his comrades, about how tired he was. He did not know that a grain of sand from their secret had fallen into the wrong hands. The queen did not know that Father Michael was thinking of intervening. They both lived under the illusion of control. Between them was a thread that seemed strong. In reality, the people around her were pulling on the same thread, and someone could break it at any moment. At the end of the second part of the story, Father Michael sat in his room, holding a blank page from a prayer book in his hands. He thought about duty, mercy, and sin. He knew that the action he was about to take would change the lives of many. He did not make a decision right away. He simply put the note on the table and went out into the corridor. Downstairs, in the storeroom, Martha closed the door and put the book back in its place, thinking she had done the right thing. No one knew that evening that the little piece of paper had left a mark that would soon become loud. Martha came out of the storeroom with the book and held the note she had taken out in her sleeve. She thought she had done the right thing. She had shown it to her father, Michael, and felt calm. She did not think that her actions would have any consequences. That same morning, the young servant, Pavel, who carried candles and often visited the storeroom, noticed Martha holding the paper. He came closer and whispered, "What do you have there?" Martha was frightened and waved him away. "It's none of your business." Pavel looked at her sleeve and saw the corner of the paper. He grabbed her hand and snatched the note. "Give it to me," he said. "I'll show it to someone. He'll decide what to do with it." Pavel took the note to his brother-in-law, whose name was Bertrand. Bertrand was the king's chamberlain, managed the royal chambers, and knew how information circulated in the court. He listened to Pavel, took the note, and did not read much of it. He looked at the handwriting and said quietly, "This is dangerous. Have you seen any more of these papers?" Pavel shrugged. Martha said there was another one in the book. Bertrand thought for a moment. He understood that if this was true, the queen had a connection, and that could be used. He knew that the king did not like rumors, but he liked order. Bertrand himself saw the benefit. If he was the first to report it, the king would remember him. He hid the note in his sleeve and went to the king's advisor. The advisor, Lord Dermond, received Bertrand in his room. He took the paper, read it, and frowned. "These are not just words," he said. "If this is confirmed, it is a blow to the throne. We must act calmly, but decisively." Bertrand nodded. They agreed that Lord Dermond would speak to the king without involving others. He wanted to hear the king's opinion first, and then act. Dermond found the king in his office. The king was sitting at his desk looking at maps. He looked up when they entered. Dermond placed the note on the desk and said briefly, "This was found in the Queen's prayer book." The king took the paper, read a few lines, and asked, "Who brought this?" Dermond named Martha and Paul. The king stood up, took his cloak, and left without a word. The king came to the Queen's chambers. She was alone, reading her prayer book. She looked up. "What happened?" The king placed the note in front of her and said evenly, "This was found in your book." She took the paper and lowered her eyes. "Where did it come from? Who?" she asked. The king remained silent. He only said, "You will explain yourself to me. Tomorrow I will convene a council. Until then, you are not to leave this room." She felt her chest tighten. She tried to speak quickly. "It's a misunderstanding. I beg you to wait. These are silly rumors." He replied dryly, "We do not play with the fate of the crown." The next day, the king summoned the elders of the court and key servants. The palace was filled with tension. People whispered. Bertrand stood aside and watched as the king spoke sternly and briefly. "If this is true," said the king, "we need to know the extent of it. I will order a search of the Queen's chambers, but it must be done delicately. No one is allowed to disgrace the crown without proof." Lord Dermond added, "Let there be 2 witnesses during the search, Father Michael and one of the guards. Everything is being done for the sake of peace in the court." The search took place in the morning. Father Michael stood in the doorway and watched silently. The servants carried out chests and rummaged through bedside tables. The Queen sat silently on a chair, holding a prayer book in her hands, although some of the books had already been taken away. Martha, Paul, and the others listened outside the door. Everyone wanted to know how the day would end. One of the guards opened a chest of drawers and took out a parchment. He read it, and his face changed. "Here they are," he said. The Queen lowered her head. Father Michael stepped forward and said quietly, "These are letters. Their handwriting matches the notes." The king looked at the woman and asked, "Are these from your hand?" She looked up and said, "I did not deny that these were my notes. I hid them in my prayer book because I was afraid. I did not think anyone would get hurt." The king looked at the letters, then at the assembled crowd, and said, "Your actions threaten the order. Who wrote these letters?" She could not answer. She silently held the prayer book and looked at where the parchment stood. Panic spread through the courtyard. Some whispered that this was a case of high treason. Lord Dermond lowered his voice. "We need to know the name. If it is a servant, it is punishable. If it is a nobleman, it is intrigue." The king asked directly, "Who?" The queen did not name him. She trembled as she replied, It was personal, not for the court." The king stood up and said, "If you hide the name, you put us all at risk. Name him, and I will decide." She looked at her father, Mikhail, as if seeking confirmation, but saw only fatigue in his eyes. He offered no advice. She lowered her head and whispered, "Jan." The word sounded heavy. A murmur spread through the hall. Jan was far away on a campaign. The king closed his eyes, then said, "He must be summoned immediately. If he does not obey, he will be considered a fugitive. He will be found." Dermond made a note and ordered the servants to prepare the messengers. Bertrand looked at the queen and saw in her face a fear that he had only seen in rare moments before. He thought he had made the right move by coming with the note. John was unaware of what was happening at the castle. He was at a guard post a week's journey away and was receiving reports on the movement of the columns. One evening, a messenger came to him. John read the letter from the king. "Return immediately. The king demands your presence at court." He looked at his companions and said quietly, "I have to leave." They gathered their horses, and John set off for the castle. On the way, he thought about the queen and the letters. He could not imagine that anyone could consider them a threat to the crown. When he approached the gate, he was met by a guard. They stopped him at the entrance and asked why he had returned. He answered honestly, "By order of the king." The guards led him to the castle and did not offer a word. Inside the palace, he was ordered to remove his weapons. He was put in a cell without explanation. Jan understood everything from the looks on people's faces. This was not just a challenge. He thought of the queen and wrote on a piece of paper, "Jan is back. Where are you?" But the letter did not reach her. The queen learned of his detention and came to the cell, even though the guards tried to stop her. She stood at the door and looked at him. He looked up and said, "You came." She sat down on a stool and said hoarsely, "I prayed all night. I thought they were acting slowly." He grabbed her hand. "Let them say what they want. I will not hide." She cried quietly. "I asked them not to send you. I thought I could manage on my own." He squeezed her hand tighter and said, "I'll come back to you if I can. But if something happens to me, know that I have no regrets." Thus began the next phase. The castle was divided between those who saw the letters as a personal weakness and those who saw them as a threat to the throne. Father Mihai became the subject of suspicion. He was seen holding the note, but he stood his ground and said he had acted according to his conscience. Marta and Pavel were silent and afraid. Bertrand received praise from Dermond, and the king prepared for trial. Jan sat in prison and waited, not knowing how it would end. The queen was left alone with the letters and the realization that their relationship was no longer a secret. She knew that the fate of both of them hung in the balance. The trial began on the third day after Jan's return. Many people gathered in the hall: knights, advisors, servants. The king sat on a high throne and looked at everyone in silence. Lord Dermond stood up and presented the charges. The letters were found in the Queen's prayer book. The relationship between the Queen and the page undermines order and could harm the state. He spoke evenly and calmly. His voice was soft, but there was no sympathy in it. Jan was brought in, bound in chains. He stood straight, looking neither at the king nor at Lord Dermond. The queen sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap. She did not cry. She looked at Jan, the way only someone who knows you best can look at you. Her eyes were empty, but there was fear in them. Dermot called several witnesses. Martha was called first. She stepped up to the platform, then fell silent. She was sworn to tell the truth. She said exactly what she had seen. I took the note out of the prayer book and showed it to Father Michael. Then it went to Paul, and Paul gave it to Bertrand. Martha spoke quietly, but some in the hall heard her words and whispered among themselves. Pavel confirmed that he had seen the note and given it to Bertrand. Bertrand explained how he had passed the note to the counselor. Father Michael was called to the hearing. He stood calmly, his hands folded. He said, "I saw the paper and went to the queen. I tried to persuade her to stop." His voice trembled when he said, "I wanted to help her preserve the honor of the crown." Someone in the hall snorted. Father Michael did not hide the fact that he had written the report to the counselor, but he said that he had done so not out of revenge, but out of duty. Then the letters were brought out. They were placed on the table and shown to everyone. Jan's handwriting matched the letters. Jan stood silently. He was given the floor. He said calmly, "Yes, I wrote them. I served Her Majesty and saw that she was lonely. She needed me. I did not think about conspiracy. I thought about her." His voice was simple. He did not ask for mercy. He did not try to justify himself with complicated words. He said what he felt, and that was enough to cause a stir in the hall. The king listened and showed no emotion. His face remained stony. When Jan finished, the king stood up and said, "Your guilt is not only personal. You were a servant at court. You betrayed that trust. This is a loss to the state." He looked at Dermot and said, "What do you suggest?" Dermot quickly replied, "A public sentence, so that the people understand the throne is above personal weaknesses." The king nodded. The sentence was harsh. Yang was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. The queen was not sentenced to death, but to public punishment and removal from office. She would be sent to a convent to repent. There was whispering in the hall, followed by a heavy silence. The queen stood up. She approached the king and said quietly, "You cannot take away the life of someone who was a human being to me. I ask you to pardon him." The king looked at her and said, "You caressed him with letters and hid them in a holy book. I cannot show weakness." He turned and added, "But I am willing to compromise. If you publicly renounce him and repent in the square, I will pardon Jan and send him into exile." His voice was firm. He believed that this would preserve order without completely discrediting the crown. The queen looked at Jan. Jan could see what she was thinking. Her lips trembled. She replied quietly, "I cannot lie. I cannot call him evil when he has done for me what no one else has done." The king frowned. He leaned towards her and said threateningly, "Bring forth a lie, and he will leave. Otherwise, he will die." She looked at Jan and said, so that the king could hear, "I do not renounce him. I speak the truth." Shouts rang out in the hall. Dermot tapped on the table and demanded attention. The king rose slowly and said, "Your pride is dear to the country, but the price will be high." He gave the order, "Carry out the sentence at the place and time to be announced in the morning." That night, the queen did not sleep. She held a prayer book in her hands and read letters. She stroked the page where their notes were written. She wrote a few words, put them in an envelope, and locked it. Father Michael walked quietly around her room. He approached her and put his hand on her shoulder. Without looking up, she said, "I knew this could happen. I thought I could hide it forever." He replied, No one hides forever, but you can soften the sentence for him if you go to the square. She pulled her hand away and said, I will not accept such a lie. He was silent. In the morning, they took Jan to the square. A crowd had gathered, but many people were shocked by the scene and couldn't quite believe what was happening. Father Michael stood to one side and prayed quietly. The queen stood in her place, looking pale. Jan walked confidently, not asking for forgiveness for what he had done. He held his head high. He whispered to one of the guards, if there's time, give this to him, and slipped him an old note with the queen's simple words. The guard nodded and put the paper in his pocket. On the scaffold, the king gave his final word. He said sternly, there must be retribution for treason, or the people will lose faith. Jan asked permission to speak. The king allowed it. Jan raised his voice and said, I loved her. I did not wish to cause harm. I asked for nothing more than to be near her. If this is treason, let it be mine. His words were simple. He looked at the queen and said, do not ask for lies for my sake. Live as you wish. I will not ask for mercy. The queen took a step forward and cried out, no, not like that. She raised her hands and said directly to the king, I am telling the truth. I do not deny it. If you kill him, you will kill me too. The guards rushed towards her. The guards grabbed her by the arms. The king shouted, get her off the stage. They dragged her back. She did not resist. Her eyes were on Jan. She saw how calm he was. She heard the final blow of fate. Before they tied the noose, Jan shouted to her, live! Don't be a prisoner of his power. She looked at him and whispered, Jan. His last word was, farewell. Then he closed his eyes. The crowd cried out. Some people wept. Father Michael knelt and crossed himself. The queen stood, her lips moving, but no words could be heard. She was led back to her chambers. After the execution, the queen was not sent to the convent immediately. The king decided that first he needed to calm the people and restore order. She was stripped of some of her privileges. She was left in the castle under supervision. The nights became her torture. She held the letters in her hands and read them over and over again. Sometimes she spoke aloud. Why did I do it? Why did I allow a man who could not give me a title to feel that he was needed by someone? She spoke and cried. Father Michael came and tried to comfort her. He said, repentance is the way, but all is not lost. She replied, I don't need a way. I need him. Dermot and Bertrand received praise from the king for exposing the betrayal. Their faces were beaming. They felt like winners. But Father Michael saw how the king looked at the queen after the execution. There was no joy in his eyes. He saw that the king's torment was deeper than it appeared. Father Michael understood that his own action, passing the note, had been the beginning of the tragedy. He did not say it aloud, but every time he entered the chapel, he trembled. Months passed. The queen was taken to a convent, as had been decided, but no longer to a quiet place, to solitary confinement. She took her vows, but no one believed that her repentance was sincere. She kept a diary and sometimes wrote, but her papers were taken away. She saw the court and the king return to their usual affairs, but for her, the world had stopped on that day in the square. Father Michael visited her often. He spoke quietly, sometimes bringing news of people who asked about her. She did not respond. Sometimes she asked for only one thing, to be given the last note from Jan. She wanted to hold it in her hands. Father Michael once found the piece of paper in a guard's pocket and brought it to her. She unfolded the sheet and read, Jan will return. Wait. She smiled as only she could smile for him, then held the paper to her heart and wept. Thus ended their life at court. Jan died in the square, the queen went to a convent, and the people returned to their business. But inside those who were close to them, there remained emptiness and guilt. Father Michael could not forget how his simple attempt to help had led to disaster. He began to serve Mass more often. Dermot and Bertrand received their rewards, but sometimes when their homes were quiet, they remembered the Queen's face in the square and realized that victory was bitter.